Welcome to the next episode of Time Out for Black History. I want to begin this episode by thanking those who have taken the time to watch my previous videos, and a special thank you to those who have subscribed to the channel. It's really nice to know that this topic, which has been neglected a lot for most of us in our own educational backgrounds, has an opportunity to be shared, and I really appreciate those people who are following along. I also wanted to take a moment to make sure that everyone out there knew there's another venture that I'm currently working on called Things White Guys Say. I'm doing it with a high school friend who happens to be a conservative. So what we do is we tackle topics, issues. We disagree on almost everything politically, but what we do is we talk about how politics shouldn't play a role in the discussion of racial equality in this country, and that we can find a common place when it comes to that. And you can find us at www.thingswhiteguysay.com, or we have a Facebook page also. So in today's episode, we are going to be looking at the origins of the transatlantic slave trade. What I mean by that is we're looking at just the beginning of what became known as the transatlantic slave trade. We're not going to get into the Middle Passage. I'll do that kind of stuff at a later episode. I want to make sure also that I emphasize this specific episode by saying that in the several decades that I've taught, one thing I've always emphasized is that it's never about blame for me. I don't spend a lot of time blaming people for who did this or who did that. What's important is learning about the events that happened, learning about those that were affected by those events, and then figuring out how we as a society can make amends for those events that put that group back in a position of being successful. And so that's what we're talking about. We're talking about understanding what happened in the transatlantic slave trade and how this event took a group of people and put them on a different course. So to preempt this whole discussion, I think the first statement that's important to understand is, for 3.5 centuries, Europeans took Africans and transported them across the world. So what became known as the African diaspora, so the forced removal of a population of people from their homeland all throughout the New World, is what we call the transatlantic slave trade. Now, we're going to focus specifically on the 5 to 7% of Africans that arrived in what we know as America. The East Coast of North America, beginning somewhere around 1619. We know that there were some that came before that, but we mark it generally at 1619, that group that arrived at Jamestown. Now, understand, when I say 5 to 7%, that means the vast amount of people kidnapped, taken from Africa, went to different parts, Brazil, the Caribbean. But we're going to focus on just that 500,000 that came to the Americas. And no, that 500,000 is going to become 4 million by 1860. So this is a large amount of people, and it changed the trajectory of history in a lot of ways. Now, a lot of European powers, and again, like I said in the beginning, this isn't about blame. I'm stating facts. I'm not blaming people. Okay, those European powers, whether it was Spain and Portugal in the beginning, we had Denmark, the Netherlands, Sweden, a bunch of countries jump in also. Then we had France, and ultimately we had the British, who controlled it through most of the 1700s into the early 1800s before they abolished it, the transatlantic slave trade. There were even American interests involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, we know America didn't become America till 1776, and the slave trade is going to be abolished technically about 30 years later. But there were American interests involved in the actual transatlantic slave trade as well as slavery. We also know that for countries like Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, all of them. The profit from this trade fueled their economies, fueled the Industrial Revolution around Europe. So it's important to understand the benefits that were brought at the expense of the continent of Africa and African American people. Because not only was it the forced removal of human beings, but we saw the transfer of goods, ivory, gold, diamonds, all those things. And one thing I was talking to my students about, trade is great, but trade is not good when one society is getting guns and rum and the other side is getting human beings, gold, and diamonds. And so it's important to know what that trade was, who was involved in it. Now, I talked at the other episode about the West African empires, and I emphasize that because that's where the majority of our descendants, the people who are black living in America, generally came from. One of the problems with really understanding that is we also know that there was a domestic slave trade in Africa. Now, the Slave Coast, which when we think of the Gold Coast, the Slave Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, West Central Africa, that was all kind of an area in which a lot of this trading happened. But we know that Africans were kidnapped on the interior of Africa and went on forced marches that sometimes lasted 8 months to a year from the interior of Africa and were brought up into that slave coast to be sold. So one of the things I always hear, and one of the things I really want to emphasize a lot in this specific episode, is all the time I hear people make an argument back to me, Mr. Fascione, slavery existed in Africa before Europeans. So why should Europeans be blamed for anything? And again, that word blame, I don't like that word blame. But I think it's important for us to understand the distinction between slavery in Africa and slavery in what's going to become known in the New World. And that's African slavery compared to European slavery. So in African slavery, what tended to make you a slave was either debt, criminal charges, products of war, and you were often folded into that society. So it was about kinship when you think about it. So you left one group and became part of another group. Were you forced into that group? Yes, you were. You often married then into that village or kingdom. Within a generation, your own generation or the next, you were free. It wasn't a lifelong servitude. Also, there were rules within the system of slavery in Africa. There were laws that you had to follow, who could be sold, how they could be sold, those kind of things. European slavery is going to be very different. It's going to be a race-based system, and it's going to be chattel slavery in terms of personal property, where you're going to lose all rights as a human being. And it's not going to be just for your life, but for the life of your child and their child also. To be black was to be a slave. To be a slave was to be black. And it wasn't always that way. We'll talk in another episode about the very beginning of the American colonies. But by the time America established itself as a country, that's what it is. And so it's important that we understand those differences, because those differences also play into when we talk about how there were African kings who sold their own people. White people didn't get off their ships, march into Africa, and start wars and conquer and take black people. That's not how the slave trade worked. In the beginning, there was kidnappings along the coast and that kind of stuff. But before long, most African populations knew the stories. They moved further inland. And so it became a process of Africans getting other Africans, bringing them to the coasts. And so were there greedy, corrupt kings that profited a great deal off the slave trade and were a very bad problem for the African people. Yes, there were. But there was also something known as the slave gun cycle. And this essentially worked to fuel the transatlantic slave trade. As Europeans arrived, they came with their wares. And they would approach different kingdoms and say, we have these weapons. In exchange for these weapons, we need bodies. And so you either took the guns or you became a victim of the guns. So it fueled wars within Africa. It fueled, and those wars were both territorial and economic, and that was about getting other people and being able to sell them to the Europeans to get more guns and more wares. And so it's important to understand that it wasn't just African tribes ready quick to sell their own people or sell people off. This was part of a larger process that kind of fueled itself. And so even when we talk about casualties from the transatlantic slave trade, we tend to only talk about the ones that existed on the Middle Passage. We don't talk about the millions upon millions of lives that were lost in the wars that were fueled by the transatlantic slave trade. And the last thing I want to make sure that you understand is what fueled this huge growth. There was no huge transatlantic slave trade in the 1400s. It's not going to be until the discovery of the Americas, the discovery of the fact that sugar plantations, tobacco plantations, all those things begin to fuel this need for labor. And you're going to have to run through things like indentured servitude, Native American enslavement, until they find this African slavery that seems to work. And we'll talk about that again in another episode, why that one was so much more effective. But again, key points in this one was the length in which this event happened, 3.5 centuries of movement, the European powers and the benefits they received from it, the African continent and what happened to the African continent within that process, the differences in slavery between European slavery and African slavery, and understanding that slave gun cycle that fueled this even more. Okay, I want to thank you again for listening. The next episode will look at the Middle Passage, the actual effects that this trade had on the African people and their arrival into the New World. So please take a few moments, share this video, subscribe, get some other people to subscribe. I want to keep bringing you more information, and I appreciate the time, and I look forward to talking to you again. Thank you.